Imagine a man who could move billions without raising his voice. A whisper from Budapest could shake Wall Street. Governments bent silently to his will, and entire networks of power danced at the tip of his pen. They called him the brain of the Russian mob, but he was more than a gangster. He was gravity itself, pulling the world into his orbit. Tonight, let me take you behind closed doors, past locked gates, into the quiet empire of Semion Mogilevich, where every decision was precise, every move calculated, and silence was the deadliest weapon of all. The morning light in Moscow filtered through thick, dusty curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the polished oak desk in the backroom office. It was a space that felt simultaneously grand and inconspicuous, a paradox that defined the man who occupied it. Semion Mogilevich sat behind the desk, hands folded, eyes scanning an array of financial documents, balance sheets, and coded messages that mapped a world invisible to everyone else. To any passerby, he might have seemed just another bureaucrat quietly reviewing numbers, yet the truth was far more potent. Every line of ink, every pen stroke, every signature in that office carried the weight of empires. Semion did not speak loudly. He did not need to. Even the faintest cough or the subtle shift of a chair in his presence seemed amplified, as though the room itself leaned forward to listen. In this stillness, Mogilevich's mind worked like a clock, every cog precise, every movement inevitable. He was a man of patterns, and the world, with all its chaos, was nothing more than a complex puzzle waiting for the correct alignment of pieces. His early life in Kiev had been marked by austerity and observation. While other children played in the courtyards and alleyways, Semion noticed transactions, observed exchanges, and memorized behaviors. He saw power not in fists or firepower but in leverage and timing. Money, he realized, was only valuable insofar as one could control its movement. Influence, he understood, was far more enduring than intimidation. From those lessons, the foundation of his empire was quietly laid. By the time he reached adulthood, Mogilevich's reputation in local circles was already formidable. Not because he shouted over tavern tables or brandished weapons, but because he anticipated the moves of everyone around him. Associates trusted him not out of fear of reprisal but because refusing him was illogical. It was a subtle, intoxicating form of authority, the kind that felt inevitable, as if the world itself had aligned to his design. It was in the late 1970s and early 1980s, during the shifting tides of the Soviet economy, that Semion began expanding beyond Kiev. The rigid structure of centralized planning created both barriers and opportunities. Many saw stagnation and danger. He saw networks to exploit and connections to cultivate. A signature on a contract could redirect millions. A whispered suggestion in the right office could open doors previously locked to outsiders. Mogilevich's talent lay in identifying where the rules could be bent, twisted, or reinterpreted, and then doing so with surgical precision. By the mid-1980s, his operations had quietly spanned Moscow, Budapest, and beyond. He was no longer a local figure. He was a calculated presence whose influence threaded through banks, corporations, and political offices. Wall Street might have seemed distant, but Semion viewed it as a chessboard, each institution a piece, each transaction a potential advantage. His associates often marveled at his foresight. Deals that others assumed required months of negotiation were completed with a simple phone call, a meticulously crafted document, and a strategy that anticipated every countermeasure. Mogilevich's approach was counterintuitive to what most associated with organized crime. There were no dramatic shootouts, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Violence was a tool of last resort, reserved only for those who failed to respect boundaries carefully constructed over years. Instead, he relied on systems, networks of trust, obligation, and meticulous record-keeping. Money flowed through layers of shell companies, each transaction creating a tapestry that was both elegant and nearly impervious to scrutiny. Observers often described his operations as poetic, though no one could have predicted just how deadly such poetry could be. Even within his immediate circle, secrecy was paramount. Semion operated in a controlled environment where information was currency and knowledge was power. Every employee, associate, or partner had their role, their level of access, and their accountability carefully delineated. Missteps were not punished with brutality but with removal or redirection, ensuring the machinery of his empire remained unbroken. To outsiders, the empire appeared seamless, almost natural, a testament to the invisible hand guiding it. Sitting at his desk, Semion often contemplated the contrast between perception and reality. The public imagined mobsters as figures of menace, brash and loud, leaving destruction in their wake. he found amusement in the misconception. True influence, he knew, required subtlety. It was the quiet, deliberate moves, the whispered deals, the subtle nudges in boardrooms, the silent instructions across borders, that reshaped markets, altered political decisions, and created entire fortunes. On this particular morning, he reviewed reports from a series of transactions that crossed multiple countries. Banks in Zurich, London, and New York had unknowingly executed movements orchestrated from this modest office. The sum total was staggering, yet there was no panic, no dramatic flourish, only the quiet hum of calculation and control. He leaned back, observing the faint patterns in the ledgers, recognizing the rhythm and predicting the next steps in a game that only he could see in full. Semion's philosophy was simple yet profound. Every system, if understood deeply, can be influenced. Every network, if mapped correctly, can be guided. To him, this principle applied to money, politics, and people alike. While others reacted to chaos, he anticipated it. While others relied on force, he relied on foresight. And while others sought recognition, he operated in the shadows, content to watch the world bend quietly to his design. As the hours passed, Mogilevich made calls to associates in multiple time zones. Each conversation was brief, precise, and deliberate. Instructions were conveyed with clarity, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The efficiency was almost hypnotic, a ballet of information and influence that left nothing to chance. Outside his office, the city moved unaware. Deals were made, fortunes shifted, governments nudged, all while the world continued its ordinary rhythm. The genius of Semion Mogilevich was not merely in the wealth he accumulated or the empire he constructed. It was in the principle of inevitability he embodied. Every choice, every move, every signature contributed to an ecosystem where his power was invisible yet undeniable. To the casual observer, he might have seemed an ordinary man with an ordinary desk. To those who understood, he was the axis around which entire networks rotated. A man whose influence was measured not in gunfire, but in precision, foresight, and the quiet hum of orchestrated systems. And so, as dusk approached and the muted light fell across the office, Semion Mogilevich remained at his desk, calm and deliberate. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the invisible hands shaping it. To many, the world moved randomly, unpredictably. To him, it followed a rhythm only he could hear. A whisper here, a signature there, and the pieces aligned perfectly. In the empire of Semion Mogilevich, silence was strategy, patience was power, and the mind was the deadliest weapon of all. In the quiet corners of Budapest, behind heavy velvet curtains and behind the anonymity of office doors, Semion Mogilevich expanded his influence in ways the world would never notice. It was a city of whispers, a city where deals were made not in conference halls but in backrooms and cafes with low ceilings. Every handshake, every signed paper, every exchange of words was a thread in a web stretching far beyond the Danube, reaching into corridors of power that stretched across continents. Budapest in the early 1980s was a city teetering between old-world charm and the weight of bureaucracy. Cobbled streets wound through squares filled with statues of forgotten leaders, and in the cafes that lined the river, businessmen and bureaucrats discussed futures with hushed tones. Semion recognized the beauty in this subtlety. Power, he mused, was far more potent when it moved silently, when influence flowed in currents invisible to the casual observer. And in Budapest, those currents were everywhere. Hidden behind closed doors, whispered over cups of coffee, written in the margins of contracts. His approach was methodical. Semion traveled lightly, often alone or with a trusted courier who could blend seamlessly into the surroundings. He did not require ostentation. His presence was felt in the precision of his transactions, in the small, deliberate changes that caused ripples far beyond the city. Banks, corporations, and even government offices became nodes in a network he could manipulate with careful timing. Each movement was calculated, each signature a pivot point. Mogilevich's first ventures into Budapest were cautious. Small investments in local enterprises, discreet partnerships with accountants and lawyers who understood the subtleties of cross-border finance. But even these minor moves carried weight. A seemingly insignificant contract could, in the right hands, redirect fortunes and open avenues that others could not perceive. To Semion, the city was a chessboard, each cafe, office, and government building a square, each person a piece to be positioned carefully. It was during these early days that he cultivated an understanding of international bureaucracy, a language often overlooked by those focused on brute force. He studied regulations, loopholes, and the interplay between local and international law. Where others saw red tape, he saw a system to be mapped and predicted. Contracts, licenses, and permits were not obstacles, they were tools. Each document was a potential lever, each signature a silent push in the direction of his design. From Budapest, Mogilevich extended his gaze toward Moscow, a city of sprawling complexity and opportunity. Here he encountered the challenge of scale. Transactions that worked seamlessly in smaller markets required layers of calculation in a metropolis dense with regulations, competing interests and the constant presence of scrutiny. Yet, where others flinched at the bureaucracy, Semion thrived. He understood that true control came not from domination but from anticipation. By predicting responses, understanding incentives, and designing systems that accounted for human behavior, he could achieve outcomes that seemed magical to outsiders. One of his earliest large-scale moves involved coordinating financial flows that spanned multiple countries. With meticulous care, he funneled resources through banks in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria, creating chains that were nearly invisible to regulatory authorities. Each step was deliberate, each intermediary carefully chosen. Mistakes were unacceptable. Redundancy and contingency were built into the architecture of his operations. Mogilevich's world was one of precision, where chaos could be anticipated and harnessed, and where a single miscalculation could unravel years of strategy. Yet he never allowed his focus to slip into arrogance. Semion understood that systems were as fragile as they were powerful. Each new connection required observation, testing, and adjustment. He maintained layers of discretion, often using proxies to relay instructions, ensuring that his identity remained insulated from risk. Even trusted associates operated under compartmentalized knowledge. No one held the entirety of the network in view except Semion himself. In this way he minimized exposure while maximizing reach. Within this intricate web, Semion developed a philosophy of controlled invisibility. Public recognition was a threat. Attention was dangerous. The most effective influence he believed was unseen influence. Decisions made quietly, moves executed without spectacle, and authority projected without display. This was the language of power he spoke fluently. Those who underestimated him, assuming that dominance required intimidation, were consistently caught off guard by the subtlety of his methods. Mogilevich's network in Budapest also provided lessons in human psychology. He observed the ways in which trust was built and broken, how fear could be leveraged ethically, and how obligation could be encoded in seemingly mundane agreements. Every partner, employee, and associate was selected not only for skill but for temperament. Semion recognized that systems were only as strong as the people who maintained them. Loyalty was cultivated, not demanded. Discretion was enforced, not threatened. In evenings when the Danube glimmered under lamplight, Semion often reflected on the architecture of his empire. To the casual passerby, he might have seemed a man contemplating numbers on a ledger. But in his mind, every detail was connected. The slight delay in a bank transfer, the timing of a legal filing, the subtle shift in a business's ownership structure. It was a world of invisible levers, all moving toward a future he could visualize with clarity. One notable maneuver involved acquiring interests in several energy firms across Central Europe. On paper, these transactions appeared unrelated and legally sound. In practice, they created a network of influence that allowed Semion to indirectly guide decisions, secure advantageous contracts, and ensure that rival factions encountered barriers they could not predict. It was not aggression, it was strategic foresight. To him, the thrill was not in confrontation but in mastery, assembling pieces so perfectly that the desired outcome seemed inevitable. Communication, too, was an art. Semion's messages were brief, unambiguous, and precise. Codes and euphemisms masked intent, ensuring that only those with the requisite understanding could interpret meaning correctly. His associates learned to read nuance in tone, pauses, and choice of words, developing a sensitivity that made the network resilient. Information became currency and Mogilevich, its banker. The cumulative effect of these operations was profound. Over months and years, what began as tentative, carefully measured steps in Budapest evolved into a sprawling web of international influence, touching finance, trade, politics, and business. Mogilevich was no longer merely a figure in regional circles. He had become a force whose presence, though largely invisible, could alter outcomes on a global scale. Governments, corporations, and individuals unwittingly moved according to patterns he had anticipated. The world, unknowingly, was bending toward his vision. Despite the scale, Semion never lost focus on the microcosm. Each small decision, whether a meeting in a quiet office, a signed document, or an innocuous handshake, was evaluated for its ripple effect. Patience was paramount, haste introduced risk. The elegance of his empire lay in its balance of patience, observation, and intervention. Each component operated within a framework that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure. By the end of this chapter in his life, Mogilevich had mastered the art of silent control. His empire was not built on fear alone, nor on brute strength. It was constructed on understanding, anticipation, and precision. And while the world outside continued with its predictable chaos, markets fluctuating, politicians maneuvering, business deals in motion, Semion's mind mapped it all, calculating the optimal course, adjusting for variables invisible to anyone else. As night settled over Budapest, the streets quieted, and lamps reflected on the rippling Danube, Mogilevich remained in his office. He observed the glow of the city through the window, each light a node in the network, each shadow a potential variable. With a slight smile, he leaned back, hands folded, knowing that the quiet empire he had built across borders was just beginning to reveal its scope. And in that silence, he held power unmatched, a subtle gravity pulling the world ever so gently, ever so inevitably into alignment with his design. He was not loud. He did not need to be. For in the stillness, in the quiet calculations of a mind attuned to the currents of influence, Semion Mogilevich had already won. The game was unfolding exactly as he intended, and the world, unknowingly, danced to his rhythm. Money is only as powerful as the mind that wields it. To the casual observer, billions flow like water, indifferent and chaotic. But to Semion Mogilevich, it was a language, a symphony, a tool of influence orchestrated with precision. Each transaction, each transfer, each seemingly mundane contract was a note in a melody that only he could hear, guiding the world's rhythm without a single shout or gunshot. The city lights of Vienna shimmered faintly along the Danube as Semion Mogilevich reviewed the latest financial flows on his secure ledger. Despite the serene appearance of the documents, rows of numbers, bank codes, shell company references, they represented a vast, interconnected ecosystem spanning Europe, North America, and beyond. A casual glance would reveal only spreadsheets. A trained eye, however, could detect the subtle patterns, the hidden threads that connected entities across continents. And in Semion's mind, every thread had a purpose, every link was deliberate. It began with an understanding that conventional banking and corporate systems were predictable. While regulators and financial officers focused on standard compliance, Mogilevich saw opportunity in the overlooked, the corners of the system left unexamined. Funds could be transferred, routed, and transformed in ways that created beneficial ambiguity, allowing movement without scrutiny. What others saw as bureaucracy, he saw as a canvas on which he could paint influence. One of his early large-scale operations involved intermediary banks in Zurich, Geneva, and Basel. Each institution was carefully chosen for reliability, secrecy, and strategic location. Semion had memorized their operating hours, staff schedules, and internal procedures. Each transfer was timed precisely, often executed in sequences that spanned multiple time zones to create a network of movement nearly invisible to external observers. It was meticulous work requiring both patience and foresight. Errors were unacceptable. Redundancy and contingency were built into every plan. He often likened the process to poetry. While others thought in terms of profit alone, Mogilevich considered rhythm, flow, and harmony. A series of transactions could be designed not just to move money, but to influence perception, stabilize networks, and preempt challenges. He could anticipate reactions from banks, regulators, and partners before they even occurred. To the uninitiated, it appeared magical, but it was the product of observation, calculation, and disciplined execution. Beyond banks, Semion's empire extended into the corporate world, where acquisitions, mergers, and shell companies became instruments of influence. Each entity in his portfolio served a purpose. Some were financial conduits, others were strategic fronts, and a few were leverage points for negotiation. Even seemingly unrelated ventures, energy firms, import-export businesses, real estate holdings, were selected with a keen eye for connectivity. The brilliance lay in their duality, legitimate operations in appearance, yet fully integrated into a system of calculated influence. Central to this strategy was information asymmetry. Mogilevich ensured that no single associate had full visibility of the network. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Instructions were encoded in layers of meaning, accessible only to those trained to interpret them. In this way, even the closest partners operated like parts of a machine, each understanding their function but not the full scope of operations. Semion alone perceived the entire architecture. A defining feature of his approach was risk anticipation. Every transfer, contract, and partnership was evaluated for potential exposure. He created simulations in his mind, considering contingencies for regulatory scrutiny, financial fluctuations, and political shifts. By envisioning a multitude of outcomes, he could preemptively design safeguards. Redundancy was not inefficiency, it was insurance against unpredictability. His operations in Wall Street were no less elegant. Though physically distant, he understood the pulse of the financial markets. Investments, hedge funds, and currency flows could be subtly influenced through layered ownership structures and discrete transactions. His fingerprints were invisible, yet the impact was undeniable. Movements orchestrated from a quiet office in Europe could ripple across global markets, altering asset valuations, corporate decisions, and strategic alliances without public awareness. What distinguished Mogilevich's method was the absence of spectacle. There were no flashy displays of wealth, no violent enforcement, no overt intimidation. Power manifested through subtlety, discipline, and foresight. Allies moved with loyalty because cooperation aligned with their interests. Rivals were guided or neutralized through strategy rather than confrontation. The empire functioned as a living system, adaptive and resilient, with Semion at its center. Even minor operations were executed with poetic care. A single financial transfer might involve a series of shell companies, each in a different jurisdiction, each masking the origin, destination, and intent. The process was designed to confuse scrutiny and clarify influence, creating a dual reality, transparent enough to appear legitimate, opaque enough to ensure control. To outsiders it seemed random, to Semion it was choreography. Mogilevich's personal discipline mirrored his operational rigor. He maintained meticulous notes, tracked every transaction, and reviewed every report personally. Time was managed with surgical precision. Every minute accounted for. This obsession with detail was not paranoia, it was mastery. He understood that in a system of global complexity, oversight at even the smallest level could unravel months or years of strategic work. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the offices of financial institutions were empty and the hum of activity subsided, Semion reflected on the elegance of the network he had constructed. The interplay of contracts, transfers, acquisitions, and agreements formed a living mosaic of influence. Every component, while independently operational, contributed to the cohesion of the system. He took satisfaction not in confrontation, but in the certainty that the architecture of control was absolute. Human relationships within the network were equally orchestrated. Employees, associates, and intermediaries were selected not only for skill but for reliability, discretion, and adaptability. Semion cultivated loyalty subtly, through respect, calculated rewards, and clear expectations. Fear was unnecessary. Compliance was achieved through understanding of mutual benefit and the inevitability of outcomes when aligned with his system. In this environment, people performed with precision, trust was mutual, and the enterprise thrived unseen. As dawn approached over the European skyline, the city bathed in muted light, Semion Mogilevich remained at his desk. Each document, each transfer, each meeting contributed to a silent symphony of power. From Budapest to Moscow, from Geneva to New York, the world moved according to patterns only he could perceive. And in this quiet mastery, Mogilevich's genius was revealed. The ultimate expression of influence is subtlety, the truest power is invisibility, and the deadliest weapon is the mind. To many, money was a tool for transactions. To him, it was a language, a story, a weapon, and an art form. And as the first light touched the rooftops, he smiled, knowing the world danced to a rhythm composed entirely by him. True power is not measured by the loudness of one's voice or the force of one's fists. It is measured by the subtlety of one's influence and the precision with which one can steer outcomes without notice. Semion Mogilevich understood this principle better than anyone. From his vantage point in a modest office tucked away in Moscow, Mogilevich observed a world in constant motion. Cities bustled, markets fluctuated, politicians debated policies, and corporations negotiated deals, all unaware of the invisible hand guiding some of these outcomes. He did not need to command armies, nor did he need to issue threats. His empire expanded through strategy, timing, and the ability to manipulate systems subtly and consistently. The early 1990s were a period of unprecedented opportunity. Eastern Europe was transitioning from rigid centralized economies to fluid markets. In this environment, Mogilevich's meticulous understanding of finance and networks gave him an edge few could rival. He leveraged his existing relationships to position himself as a pivotal intermediary, someone whose approval or cooperation could determine the success or failure of major transactions. It was a quiet form of dominance, No one could see him controlling the boardrooms, yet his influence shaped outcomes across industries. One example was his entry into the energy sector. Rather than purchasing companies outright with a public display of wealth, Mogilevich acquired minority stakes through a series of interconnected shell corporations. Each stake was legally sound, seemingly unrelated, and executed in different jurisdictions. On the surface, no one could connect the dots. But each piece fit into a larger architecture, allowing him to guide decisions from the shadows. Contracts, voting rights, and corporate policies all bent subtly in his favor. Over time, what appeared as independent corporate choices were, in fact, influenced by a single mind. He replicated this approach across other industries: import-export firms, real estate, and even cultural enterprises such as media outlets. Each venture served a dual purpose: generating profit while reinforcing networks of influence. Mogilevich understood that power was strongest when it appeared spontaneous or organic. By allowing others to believe they were making independent decisions, he maintained control without confrontation. His dealings were not restricted to corporate mechanics. Mogilevich observed the intersections of finance and politics with keen interest. Regulations, government approvals, and policy shifts were all variables in the equation. By cultivating relationships with key figures, legally and discreetly, he ensured that the environments in which his businesses operated were favorable. Influence was exercised not through coercion, but through alignment of incentives. Politicians, bankers, and industrialists all became components in a carefully designed system, each reacting predictably when guided subtly. Even the markets themselves were instruments of his strategy. Mogilevich could anticipate fluctuations by analyzing patterns of capital movement, political discourse, and corporate behavior. Transfers orchestrated across banks and jurisdictions could stabilize or destabilize specific sectors, creating conditions that maximized his advantage. It was a chess game played across continents, where timing, foresight, and precision mattered more than brute force. Within his network, Semion enforced a philosophy of controlled compartmentalization. No associate held complete knowledge of operations. Each knew only their role and the immediate objectives, reducing risk and enhancing operational security. Communication was concise, encrypted when necessary, and deliberately layered with meaning. Even in the event of exposure, the network was resilient, with no single failure capable of unraveling the entire system. Patience was paramount. Mogilevich often waited for years to see the impact of a single strategic move. Deals executed today could bear fruit months or even years later. This long-term perspective distinguished him from less disciplined operators. While others sought immediate returns or visible victories, he played a game measured in decades. The satisfaction lay not in dramatic confrontation but in the gradual, inevitable unfolding of carefully orchestrated plans. Yet, despite this meticulous attention to systems and strategy, Mogilevich remained acutely aware of the human element. Loyalty, discretion, and reliability were as essential as legal and financial acumen. He cultivated these traits through subtle incentives, clear expectations, and an environment in which trust was both demanded and earned. Fear was unnecessary. Understanding and alignment of interests sufficed. Those who operated within his network did so because it was rational, profitable, and secure, not because they feared reprisal. By the mid-1990s, the results of his strategy were unmistakable. Mogilevich's reach extended across borders and industries, yet remained largely invisible to the public eye. Governments, corporations, and markets moved in patterns he had anticipated. Political decisions shifted subtly under the influence of strategic interventions. Financial flows, while appearing independent and legitimate, were often routed in ways that reinforced his control. It was power exercised quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle, the hallmark of a master strategist. Mogilevich often reflected on the contrast between his methods and the traditional image of organized crime. Where most imagined violence, brashness, and display, he relied on calculation, foresight, and the disciplined execution of systems. His empire was a network of influence, not intimidation. The elegance of his operations lay in their invisibility. The fewer noticed, the more effective the control. Influence did not need to announce itself, it simply was. Even mundane details were considered carefully. Meeting times, locations, the sequence of document exchanges, and the selection of intermediaries were orchestrated to minimize exposure while maximizing effect. Each component was like a note in a symphony, harmonious and deliberate. By maintaining this control over the smallest details, he ensured the integrity and continuity of his operations. Mistakes were rare, opportunities were seized efficiently. In moments of reflection, Semion also considered the philosophical dimension of his work. Influence, he recognized, was not coercion but orchestration. Control was not about domination but alignment. By understanding the motivations, limitations, and tendencies of people and institutions, he could design conditions where desired outcomes emerged naturally. The world, in effect, moved as if guided by invisible hands, his hands. As night fell over Moscow, the office remained lit, warm light spilling across ledgers and reports. The city outside pulsed with ordinary activity. Streetlights flickered, cars passed, and distant voices echoed. Yet within this quiet office, Mogilevich's empire hummed with unseen life. Every calculation, every transaction, every subtle adjustment contributed to a system operating seamlessly across borders, markets, and industries. And in the calm of that night, as he reviewed the network of connections, Semion Mogilevich understood a truth few could grasp. True power is invisible, subtle, and patient. It is exercised not through spectacle, not through fear, but through mastery of systems and foresight of human behavior. By the time the world recognized any change, the course had already been set, and it was precisely as he had intended. In a world of chaos and unpredictability, he had crafted order. In a realm of noise and distraction, he had created silence. And in that silence, his influence was absolute. Even the most meticulously constructed empire can stumble. But in every misstep lies insight, and in every failure, an opportunity for refinement. Semion Mogilevich knew that perfection was not about avoiding error, it was about learning faster, observing deeper, and adapting quietly. The early years of Mogilevich's international expansion were marked not only by victories but by subtle setbacks, moments imperceptible to outsiders yet instructive to a mind attuned to patterns and consequence. A miscalculated transfer here, a delayed approval there, or an unexpected regulatory inquiry could have jeopardized operations. Yet, in each instance, Semion approached the situation not with panic, nor with displays of power, but with calculated reflection. He dissected every outcome, tracing each variable to its source, understanding the interplay between human behavior, institutional inertia, and the fluidity of markets. One incident in particular illustrates his philosophy. A minor European bank, chosen for its discretion and reliability, unexpectedly flagged a sequence of transactions as suspicious. The transfers, while fully legal, had been structured across multiple jurisdictions to optimize efficiency and mitigate visibility. Most executives would have reacted with urgency, perhaps even confrontation. Semion, however, leaned back, observing the patterns with a calm intensity. He anticipated the bank's response, identified the triggers for scrutiny, and devised a corrective approach that satisfied regulatory oversight without revealing the full architecture of his network. By the time the issue was resolved, the system was stronger than before, fortified by the knowledge gained from this minor disruption. This approach exemplified a fundamental principle in Mogilevich's operations. Every failure contained embedded intelligence. To him, setbacks were data points, lessons in the anatomy of systems, human behavior, and institutional vulnerabilities. He meticulously recorded outcomes, cross-referenced with prior operations, and adjusted protocols accordingly. No error was wasted, no anomaly overlooked. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by ledgers, contracts, and coded notes, he transformed each potential vulnerability into an instrument of insight and resilience. Beyond operational mishaps, human unpredictability posed another layer of complexity. Associates could misinterpret instructions, act impulsively, or falter in discretion. Mogilevich's solution was elegant in its simplicity: anticipate behavior, design for error, and cultivate redundancy. Each critical node in his network was backed by alternative pathways, ensuring continuity even when one link faltered. Communication was layered, instructions encoded subtly, and accountability clearly delineated. These measures minimized risk without invoking fear or coercion, relying instead on structure, clarity, and foresight. The lessons drawn from early setbacks also informed Mogilevich's approach to expansion. Rather than pursuing immediate gain, he favored strategic patience, allowing time for systems to mature, relationships to solidify, and processes to stabilize. He understood that short-term victories often concealed long-term vulnerabilities, whereas deliberate, incremental progress yielded sustainable influence. The slow accumulation of subtle power, he realized, was far more durable than flashy visible control. Even in moments of reflection, Semion considered the broader implications of his failures. Economic fluctuations, political upheavals, and shifts in regulatory landscapes were not merely obstacles, they were opportunities to test, observe, and adapt. By maintaining a disciplined approach to learning, he ensured that his operations evolved alongside the world, rather than lagging behind it. In essence, Mogilevich's empire was not static, it was an organism, continuously recalibrating and optimizing itself through experience. A key component of this learning process was analytical rigor. Semion maintained detailed records of every transaction, correspondence, and operational decision. He annotated outcomes, tracked deviations from expected behavior, and identified root causes of errors. This exhaustive documentation served as both a historical archive and a tool for predictive modeling. Over time, the accumulated knowledge enabled him to anticipate not only immediate consequences but also cascading effects across networks and jurisdictions. Human psychology was equally critical. Semion observed patterns of trust, ambition, greed, and loyalty among his associates and counterparts. By understanding motivations, he could design frameworks that aligned incentives, mitigated risk, and reinforced desired behavior. For instance, a partner who had previously made a misstep could be reintegrated with clear boundaries, accountability, and guidance, transforming a liability into a strengthened node in the network. Errors, in this light, were correctable rather than destructive, provided they were contextualized within a system of observation and adaptation. Mogilevich's meticulous attention extended to international financial regulations. Cross-border operations inherently carried exposure, yet he approached complexity as a domain to master rather than a threat to fear. By mapping regulatory frameworks, understanding enforcement tendencies, and monitoring shifts in policy, he could predict responses and structure operations to remain compliant while maintaining strategic advantage. Where others saw risk, he saw the contours of opportunity. The interplay between human and systemic factors created a feedback loop that enhanced the resilience of his empire. Mistakes illuminated vulnerabilities, analysis informed strategy, refinement reinforced control. In this iterative process, Semion cultivated a network that was self-correcting and adaptive, capable of absorbing minor shocks without compromising overarching objectives. It was a silent, methodical evolution, one that outsiders would never witness, yet whose effects were undeniable. By the time evening fell over Moscow, the city bathed in muted light, Mogilevich had reviewed numerous reports, recalibrated plans, and guided adjustments across multiple operations. Each minor failure had been converted into insight, each potential disruption anticipated and mitigated. The result was an increasingly sophisticated network, more robust, more precise, and more invisible than ever before. In solitude, he reflected on the philosophical underpinnings of this approach. To many, failure is shameful, a cause for panic or overreaction. To Semion, it was a teacher, a mirror revealing the imperfections in systems, the tendencies of human behavior, and the opportunities hidden within complexity. Mastery, he knew, was not about avoiding error, it was about integrating experience into design, ensuring that the network became smarter, stronger, and more resilient with each challenge. And so, as the lights of Moscow shimmered against the evening sky and the hum of the city carried on unseen, Semion Mogilevich sat quietly in his office. The minor failures, the setbacks, the unpredictabilities, all were folded into the architecture of an empire that moved with elegance and precision. In the shadows of what seemed ordinary, he had learned to anticipate, adapt, and perfect. Every misstep had become a stepping stone, every challenge a refinement of strategy, and every moment of uncertainty a lesson in silent power. In a world that often rewards noise and spectacle, he had discovered the quiet rhythm of mastery. And in that rhythm, he found the ultimate strength, the ability to turn failure itself into a weapon of inevitability. The world, Semion Mogilevich realized, was a network of invisible threads. Each market, each city, each institution was a node. An influence, like electricity, flowed silently through the connections only he could map. To the untrained eye, his empire appeared fragmented, even disjointed. To him it was perfect geometry, a lattice of power expanding quietly, inexorably across borders. In the mid-1990s, Europe was a continent in transition. Political borders were shifting, economies were opening, and new financial instruments were emerging. While most businessmen reacted with caution, hesitating at every regulatory change or market fluctuation, Semion saw possibility in flux. Opportunity did not arrive dressed in clarity, it came cloaked in ambiguity, waiting for someone with patience and vision to seize it. And Semion possessed both in abundance. Budapest had been a proving ground, Moscow the operational heart, and now he turned his attention to new markets across Central and Western Europe. He began exploring investments in energy distribution, logistics, and commodity trading. These were industries with high stakes, complex regulations, and potential for subtle influence, perfect terrain for his approach. Unlike conventional expansion, Semion's strategy was not aggressive takeover but strategic positioning. He acquired minority stakes, established silent partnerships, and positioned trusted intermediaries to operate with discretion. Each move was a calculated step in a broader lattice of influence. In Vienna, he frequented nondescript cafes and offices, places where deals were conducted in whispers and contracts were exchanged under the guise of ordinary business. Here he observed patterns, which officials were susceptible to subtle persuasion, which bankers followed procedure without deviation, and which competitors could be anticipated. Every observation was logged mentally, integrated into his mental map of Europe's financial and political landscape. His operations were characterized by layered complexity. One transaction might involve several shell companies across multiple jurisdictions, each legally compliant but collectively designed to route capital with precision. Each step in the process was deliberate, ensuring that the flow of funds was controlled yet undetectable to casual oversight. Semion understood that opacity was as powerful as capital itself, and he mastered both in equal measure. A critical component of his expansion was the careful cultivation of human networks. Associates were selected not only for skill but for temperament, discretion, and adaptability. Semion's philosophy was clear. Trust was earned through alignment of interests, not imposed through fear. By ensuring that every participant understood their role and the logic of the system, he minimized risk while maximizing efficiency. Every link in his network was both autonomous and connected, capable of acting independently yet always advancing the broader strategy. Cross-border operations introduced the challenge of regulatory diversity. Laws, banking regulations, and corporate governance standards varied widely across countries, creating a labyrinth of potential obstacles. Mogilevich approached this not as a hindrance but as a puzzle. By mapping the intricacies of each jurisdiction, he could anticipate responses, design compliant yet advantageous structures, and maneuver with precision. Each country added complexity but also opportunity, if one understood the rules well enough to bend them subtly. One particularly intricate maneuver involved coordinating energy contracts in 3 separate countries. By establishing shell entities and intermediaries in each jurisdiction, he created a structure that appeared as multiple independent actors. In reality, the entities were interconnected, guided by a centralized strategy. Through subtle influence, he could ensure favorable contract terms, strategic partnerships, and operational efficiency, all while remaining invisible. The world saw legitimacy, he saw control. Even communication was orchestrated with care. Instructions were precise but often layered with ambiguity, allowing for interpretation that maintained discretion while preserving fidelity to strategic goals. Email, courier documents, and coded language were all tools in a carefully maintained system. Every message, every meeting, every handshake was a potential pivot point, reinforcing the lattice of influence while maintaining operational security. Mogilevich also appreciated the temporal dimension of strategy. He understood that influence was not always immediate. Sometimes the most effective interventions were those that ripened over months or years. Patience was a weapon. By allowing systems and human behaviors to evolve naturally, he could exploit opportunities with minimal risk and maximum gain. Hasty action was avoided. Deliberate, calculated timing was valued above all. His network in the new markets was constantly evolving. Each success, each misstep, each observation informed adjustments. Redundancy was built in. Every critical function had alternative pathways. Failures were not catastrophic, they were data points for refinement. Semion's operations became more resilient with each iteration, a living network adapting to shifting conditions while preserving the integrity of his empire. Yet, for all its complexity, the underlying principle was simple: control through alignment. Markets, officials, and associates were guided not by overt coercion but by incentives, structure, and the anticipation of behavior. By understanding motivations, predicting actions, and structuring interactions, Mogilevich could orchestrate outcomes silently and efficiently. To the world, it appeared that independent actors operated freely. In truth, their movements often followed patterns he had subtly guided. As evening descended over Vienna, the city lights reflecting off the Danube shimmered like nodes in an invisible network. Mogilevich sat quietly in a modest office overlooking the river, reviewing reports, adjusting plans, and anticipating the next set of moves. Each connection, each transaction, each handshake was a thread in the web he had woven across borders. And in the stillness, he found the rhythm of influence, the subtle poetry of control. Semion's philosophy extended beyond operations. It encompassed a vision of the world itself. He recognized that influence was most potent when undetected, that power wielded quietly could outlast brute force. By mastering systems, anticipating behavior, and aligning incentives, he had crafted a framework in which he was the central axis, a silent force shaping outcomes without spectacle or alarm. Across borders, markets, and industries, his empire grew in silence. Every observation became insight, every transaction a lesson, and every subtle adjustment a step toward an inevitable alignment. The world moved unaware, yet it moved according to his design. In the quiet geometry of his empire, Semion Mogilevich was already winning. In the world of power, noise is a liability. The loudest actors are the most easily predicted. Semion Mogilevich understood that influence is strongest when it is unseen, and authority is most absolute when it is silent. The quiet office in Moscow was filled with the soft hum of heating pipes and the distant murmur of traffic beyond tall, frost-covered windows. Semion Mogilevich sat at his desk, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the ledger before him. To anyone looking in, it was a scene of ordinariness, a man reviewing papers in a quiet room. But in reality, every line on those pages, every transaction recorded, and every note in the margins was part of a larger system of control, meticulously designed to operate invisibly. Mogilevich's strength lay not in confrontation but in the architecture of secrecy. He had learned early that transparency invites scrutiny, that visibility invites challenge. To safeguard his empire, he employed layers of obfuscation, shell companies, offshore accounts, and intermediaries who acted as buffers between him and operational realities. This was not paranoia, it was strategic foresight. Each layer ensured that even if one link was compromised, the integrity of the larger system remained intact. One of the most important tools in maintaining secrecy was compartmentalization. Associates knew only what they needed to perform their role. No individual, however trusted, had complete knowledge of operations. This meant that information was distributed, controlled, and limited, reducing the risk of exposure while ensuring that the system functioned efficiently. Mogilevich often compared this to a puzzle. Each piece contributed to the image, but only the designer could see the full picture. Physical meetings were rare and conducted with care. When face-to-face discussions were necessary, they occurred in nondescript locations, small offices, quiet cafes, or rented meeting rooms with no identifying signs. Conversations were deliberate and concise, conveying instructions without revealing the broader strategy. Semion often relied on trusted intermediaries, who understood context without requiring access to sensitive details. In this way, the flow of information was controlled, precise, and secure. Even communication methods were designed to minimize risk. Codes, euphemisms, and indirect language were used routinely. Documents were encrypted, and instructions were layered with multiple meanings to ensure only the intended recipient could interpret the full intent. Semion's meticulous attention to language allowed him to orchestrate complex operations without ever revealing his hand. To outsiders, interactions appeared mundane. In reality, they were the threads holding the empire together. His philosophy extended to the human element as well. Mogilevich understood that secrecy alone was insufficient without discipline and reliability among those who executed his plans. Associates were carefully selected not only for skill but also for temperament, discretion, and loyalty. By aligning incentives and establishing clear expectations, he created an environment where compliance was rational, not enforced. Fear was unnecessary, structure, clarity, and shared objectives were enough. A critical aspect of his approach was anticipating observation. Mogilevich assumed that every move could be monitored, every transaction noted. By planning operations with the potential for scrutiny in mind, he could create layers of legitimacy that masked true intent. Regulatory compliance, corporate structures, and formal documentation were not obstacles. They were tools to legitimize and obscure simultaneously. Each action served dual purposes, advancing objectives while minimizing exposure. Over time, this discipline of secrecy became habitual, woven into the very fabric of his operations. Semion often reflected on the contrast between his methods and the traditional perception of organized crime. While popular imagination suggested violence, intimidation, and spectacle, Mogilevich operated with silence, precision, and anticipation. His power was effective because it was invisible, exerted through the structure of systems, the alignment of incentives, and the subtle manipulation of perception. Even when setbacks occurred, secrecy ensured resilience. Mistakes or unexpected scrutiny were contained within compartments, preventing a single failure from cascading across the network. Lessons were internalized, protocols refined, and operations adjusted, all without drawing attention. In this environment, the empire was not fragile. It was adaptive, resilient, and self-correcting. As dusk settled over the city, the soft glow of streetlights reflected on frost-covered windows, and Semion remained at his desk. The ledger before him documented countless transactions, yet its significance extended far beyond numbers. Each entry represented a carefully managed risk, a calculated move in an intricate web of influence. From Budapest to Moscow, from corporate boardrooms to energy markets, his empire functioned quietly, imperceptibly, yet decisively. Mogilevich also understood the importance of perception. By remaining in the shadows, he controlled how the world perceived his presence, or more accurately, his absence. The less visible he was, the more powerful he became. By cultivating a reputation for invisibility and discretion, he ensured that his influence operated without interference. Decisions, deals, and policies were shaped in subtle ways, often without anyone realizing a single mind guided the flow. This principle of silent authority extended to the digital and financial dimensions of his network. Systems were designed to operate autonomously, yet within parameters he understood fully. Even when physical presence was impossible, influence could be exerted remotely through intermediaries, automated transactions, and carefully orchestrated processes. In effect, the empire became a living organism, guided by an unseen hand that controlled its movements with precision. By the end of the night, Mogilevich had reviewed reports from multiple regions, adjusted strategies for upcoming financial moves, and ensured that the network's integrity remained intact. Every layer of secrecy, every protocol, and every controlled interaction reinforced the structure of his empire. Outside, the city continued its rhythms, oblivious to the quiet mastery at work within a single office. In the absence of noise, power manifests with subtlety. In the stillness, decisions ripple across markets, industries, and governments. And in the silence of those who truly understand systems, Semion Mogilevich reigned absolute. An empire is only as strong as the people who sustain it. Semion Mogilevich knew that loyalty, discretion, and subtlety were the pillars upon which influence could be built. And in every silent interaction, every calculated decision, he ensured that his network of associates operated not by fear, but by understanding, alignment, and trust. The corridors of Mogilevich's empire were not lined with guards or enforcers. They were composed of people, individuals carefully chosen, meticulously trained, and subtly guided. From financial analysts in Zurich to corporate managers in Vienna, from legal intermediaries in Budapest to trusted couriers in Moscow, each person played a critical role. Yet no one fully grasped the magnitude of the empire they were part of. Semion designed it this way intentionally. Knowledge was power, and he alone wielded the full spectrum. His selection process was exacting. Potential associates were evaluated for intelligence, reliability, discretion, and temperament. An individual might have impeccable technical skill, but if they could not adhere to the demands of confidentiality or lacked patience, they were unsuitable. Mogilevich believed that systems could fail when human unpredictability was introduced, and he mitigated this by cultivating the right blend of competence and temperament. Once inside the network, each associate operated within a framework of clearly defined responsibilities. Instructions were precise, outcomes measurable, and accountability inherent. Yet even as roles were defined, autonomy was granted within constraints, allowing people to act efficiently without exposing the broader system. Semion understood that micromanagement stifled initiative. By balancing structure with discretion, he ensured both reliability and adaptability. One of his most effective techniques was alignment of incentives. Associates were motivated not by fear or coercion, but by a combination of opportunity, reputation, and logical self-interest. They understood that compliance and diligence yielded tangible benefits, while deviation introduced inefficiency or risk. Over time, loyalty emerged organically, reinforced not by threat, but by the rational recognition that the system was designed for mutual success, albeit under Semion's careful orchestration. Mogilevich also leveraged human psychology to maintain stability. He observed how people reacted under pressure, how ambition and curiosity could be guided toward productive ends, and how subtle reinforcement could enhance compliance. Meetings were conducted quietly, discussions measured, and tasks delegated in ways that preserved operational security. Even the simplest interaction, a handshake, a brief conversation, a note in a ledger, served as a vector for influence and subtle instruction. He maintained distance both physically and informationally. Associates often did not meet him directly, interacting through trusted intermediaries or coded communications. This separation reduced risk, maintained objectivity, and reinforced the illusion of independence. In reality, all nodes of the network were connected to a central design only Semion fully understood. Each person was a cog in a machine, essential but unaware of the entire mechanism. Conflict within the network was rare, yet when it arose, Mogilevich's method was strategic rather than reactive. Discrepancies were investigated quietly, errors corrected, and lessons learned were integrated systemically. Punishment was not a spectacle, it was structural. Misaligned individuals were reassigned, replaced, or guided to better align with expectations. By removing drama from enforcement, he ensured stability, continuity, and trust. Training and mentoring were subtle but pervasive. Semion often observed his associates' decisions remotely, offering feedback through indirect channels. He emphasized critical thinking, discretion, and anticipation, nurturing skills that would allow the network to operate independently without compromising its secrecy or efficacy. Over time, his associates became adept at interpreting nuance, recognizing patterns, and executing strategy, all while remaining unaware of the full scope of operations. One particularly illustrative example involved a corporate intermediary in Vienna, tasked with facilitating a series of complex financial transfers. Semion had designed the instructions to be intentionally minimal, providing only the necessary context. Yet the intermediary executed the task flawlessly, adapting to minor unforeseen complications without deviating from the strategic intent. This was a hallmark of Semion's methodology. Empower individuals with enough autonomy to act, but design systems where alignment with the overarching plan was inevitable. Even in large-scale operations, Mogilevich's attention to people remained precise. Regional managers, financial analysts, and legal advisors each operated with partial knowledge, guided by implicit understanding of priorities and risk thresholds. Coordination occurred through subtle signals, carefully structured communications, and reinforced behavioral norms. This allowed for efficiency, adaptability, and security, even as the network expanded across borders and industries. Mogilevich also understood the importance of perception management within the network. Associates were aware that their actions had consequences, not only for the organization but also for their own positions and opportunities. By cultivating an environment of accountability, expectation, and strategic ambiguity, he ensured that behavior aligned with his objectives without direct oversight. In this way, trust, discipline, and compliance were embedded within the system itself. The broader implication of his methodology was profound. Power could be exercised indirectly, yet with certainty. Individuals believed they were acting autonomously, yet their actions reinforced Semion's strategic design. Decisions made daily by people across multiple cities and countries converged to produce outcomes that served the empire's objectives. It was a subtle, elegant form of control, one that required patience, observation, and deep understanding of human behavior. As night fell over Moscow and Vienna, the quiet hum of activity persisted across the network. Each associate, unaware of the full picture, executed their responsibilities with diligence, contributing to an empire that seemed organic and decentralized. Yet at its core, every movement, every decision, every subtle action was aligned with Semion Mogilevich's vision. The power he wielded was silent, invisible, and absolute, residing not in force but in the orchestration of human action. In the shadows of ordinary offices and cafes, in the quiet coordination of tasks and the invisible guidance of individuals, Semion Mogilevich's influence spread like an unseen tide. And in that tide, the people behind the veil, loyal, disciplined, and unaware of their central role, propelled his empire forward, seamlessly and silently. Power, Semion Mogilevich realized, was most effective when it left no trace. Markets shifted subtly, policies bent imperceptibly, and corporate decisions aligned almost naturally, as if guided by invisible hands. The true genius of influence was that it could operate silently, shaping outcomes before anyone recognized a change had occurred. By the late 1990s, Mogilevich's operations had reached a scale few could imagine. The empire, carefully nurtured over decades, now interfaced with governments, multinational corporations, and financial institutions. Yet despite the vast reach, his presence was imperceptible. He was a ghost in the machinery, unseen but undeniably influential. One of the key arenas of his influence was government policy. While many associated organized crime with corruption or intimidation, Semion's approach was far subtler. He did not coerce officials with threats or displays of force. Instead, he leveraged insider knowledge, strategic alliances, and indirect pressure to guide decisions. For instance, legislation affecting energy distribution, import-export regulations, or financial compliance could be influenced through intermediaries who presented recommendations as independent or expert advice. By aligning incentives and demonstrating plausible rationales, Semion ensured outcomes favorable to his interests without leaving evidence of his involvement. Simultaneously, Mogilevich exerted influence over the corporate world. Boards, executives, and shareholders operated under the illusion of independence, making decisions based on available data and market signals. Yet through strategic ownership stakes, carefully placed intermediaries, and silent advisory roles, Semion guided these decisions. Contracts, acquisitions, and financial strategies all reflected subtle pressures, calibrated to produce predictable results. The beauty of the system lay in its invisibility. Those affected were unaware of the orchestrated patterns shaping their choices. Financial markets were another domain of influence. Mogilevich had long understood that movements in capital could shape perception, opportunity, and leverage. By controlling flows across jurisdictions, he could stabilize or destabilize sectors as necessary. A sequence of transactions in one country might influence investor confidence in another. A subtle shift in corporate governance could redirect partnerships or contracts. Each ripple was calculated, timed with precision, and executed in a manner that masked the source. Markets responded not to overt manipulation, but to the silent guidance of an unseen hand. His strategic approach to risk management further amplified his influence. Anticipating potential disruptions, from regulatory audits to geopolitical events, Mogilevich developed contingency plans embedded within the architecture of his network. Redundancies, alternative pathways, and adaptive structures ensured that operations continued smoothly even under unforeseen circumstances. This resilience reinforced his credibility. Partners and associates grew confident in the system's reliability, further enhancing his ability to shape outcomes indirectly. An illustrative example involved energy contracts across Central Europe. Through a combination of minority ownership stakes, intermediaries in multiple jurisdictions, and carefully timed transactions, Semion could influence pricing, supplier selection, and project approvals without direct involvement. Companies believed they acted independently, regulators saw compliance, and investors observed legitimate transactions. In reality, each movement was orchestrated to align with strategic objectives, demonstrating the subtle, yet profound, impact of invisible influence. Mogilevich's attention to human behavior was critical in this context. He understood that people respond predictably when guided by incentives, constraints, and expectations. By anticipating reactions and structuring environments accordingly, he could induce desired outcomes while maintaining the appearance of autonomy. Associates, corporate partners, and even public officials acted in ways that reinforced his strategic design, often without conscious awareness. Communication, as always, was a tool of precision. Messages were concise, layered, and often coded, ensuring that operational intent was transmitted without revealing the full scope. Semion often relied on intermediaries who understood context and priorities, enabling them to act decisively while preserving secrecy. Even a minor misinterpretation could have cascading effects, so the architecture of communication was as meticulously designed as financial or corporate structures. By maintaining distance and discretion, Mogilevich ensured that exposure was minimized. Few could trace the network back to him, and even fewer could predict the full extent of his reach. Influence operated in waves, subtle, pervasive, and enduring. While public attention focused on visible actors, Semion remained in the shadows, quietly guiding the currents of politics, finance, and industry. As evening fell across the European skyline, Mogilevich reviewed reports from multiple countries. Each update confirmed the efficacy of his systems. Market movements aligned with projections, regulatory approvals followed anticipated paths, and corporate decisions unfolded as intended. The network was stable, resilient, and responsive. It was a living system, adaptive and silent, whose outcomes reinforced the illusion of independence while consolidating his unseen control. Mogilevich often reflected on the philosophical dimension of this power. Unlike conventional forms of authority that rely on visibility, spectacle, or force, he had mastered influence as an art form, precise and invisible. Decisions were shaped not by coercion but by strategic design, anticipation, and alignment of incentives. By the time the world recognized any shift, the trajectory had already been determined. In the stillness of offices, the quiet hum of financial systems, and the subtle movements of people guided by invisible threads, Semion Mogilevich's influence flowed. Governments, markets, and corporations moved as if independently, yet they danced to a rhythm composed entirely by him. And in that rhythm, his power was absolute, unseen, and enduring. Money, Semion Mogilevich often thought, was more than currency. It was a language, a rhythm, a flow that could be orchestrated like a symphony. To the untrained eye, billions moved chaotically across borders. To him, it was poetry, a composition of precision, subtlety, and invisible influence. From the quiet of his office in Vienna, Mogilevich observed the movement of capital across Europe, North America, and the emerging markets of Eastern Europe. The operations were vast, intricate, and layered, involving multiple financial institutions, shell corporations, and intermediaries who acted with disciplined precision. Each transfer was meticulously timed, executed in sequences that spanned multiple time zones, and structured to obscure origin and destination without drawing suspicion. Relying on multi-jurisdictional strategies, Semion used banks in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg to channel funds, creating layers that insulated his operations from direct scrutiny. Each step was legal on paper, yet combined they formed a network optimized for discretion, efficiency, and strategic control. Observers could trace individual transactions, but the overall pattern remained invisible, a silent web of influence stretching across continents. He often described this process as a form of art. Just as a composer arranges notes to evoke emotion, Mogilevich arranged transfers, investments, and contracts to produce desired outcomes without overt action. Money was not merely wealth, it was influence, trust, and the ability to steer events. A single transaction executed with precision could shift corporate decisions, stabilize sectors, or incentivize cooperation from key figures, all without direct interaction. A crucial aspect of these operations was compartmentalization and layered control. Associates involved in transfers or business deals were given only the information necessary for their role. No one had full visibility, reducing risk and ensuring that even if a component failed, the system remained intact. This method extended to intermediaries, accountants, and lawyers who operated within defined parameters, ensuring compliance and discretion while advancing strategic objectives. Redundancy was another pillar of Mogilevich's methodology. Parallel pathways, backup accounts, and alternative corporate structures allowed operations to continue seamlessly even if a transaction was delayed, a bank raised questions, or regulations shifted unexpectedly. These contingencies were not afterthoughts, they were integral components of the design, reflecting the discipline and foresight central to his approach. The elegance of his strategy lay in its subtlety. Unlike violent or coercive methods often associated with organized crime, Mogilevich relied on anticipation, precision, and the natural flow of systems. Every decision was calculated, every pathway considered, and every contingency planned. By aligning human behavior, institutional patterns, and financial instruments, he could achieve outcomes that appeared organic yet were orchestrated meticulously. Even minor transfers were executed with care. For instance, a sequence designed to move capital through a chain of 5 corporations in 3 countries might appear mundane or routine, but in reality, it served multiple purposes: minimizing regulatory scrutiny, reinforcing alliances, and establishing influence over key entities. The result was a system that operated efficiently, securely, and invisibly. Mogilevich's attention extended to the human element within financial operations. Associates were trained to recognize subtle cues, interpret layered instructions, and respond to unforeseen contingencies. Semion understood that human error could compromise even the most elegant system, so he invested in cultivating awareness, discipline, and judgment among his collaborators. The network was thus resilient, capable of adapting dynamically while remaining aligned with strategic goals. The process also incorporated anticipatory adjustments. Market shifts, regulatory changes, and geopolitical events were continuously monitored. Semion evaluated potential outcomes, adjusted transaction pathways, and recalibrated strategies to maintain operational stability and advantage. Each decision, even seemingly small, contributed to a cascading series of controlled outcomes that reinforced the empire's influence. This philosophy extended to cross-border financial relationships. Partnerships with institutions in multiple jurisdictions provided both access and cover. Semion leveraged local compliance norms, banking confidentiality laws, and corporate governance regulations to structure operations that were both legitimate and strategically opaque. Each interaction was crafted to maximize influence while minimizing exposure, ensuring that visibility never equated to vulnerability. Mogilevich also understood timing as a critical component of financial orchestration. Transfers, approvals, and investments were executed not merely based on necessity but on optimal impact. The sequencing of operations created cumulative effects that amplified results. In essence, the poetry of money lay in the flow, rhythm, and timing of its movement, not in the sums themselves. By the end of the day, the network of transactions, investments, and partnerships functioned like a symphony. Each element, from minor transfers to major contracts, harmonized with the broader structure. Semion observed the patterns with satisfaction. Markets shifted subtly, alliances strengthened silently, and influence extended without trace. The system was elegant, resilient, and invisible, a testament to his mastery of money as both tool and language. In the silence of offices and the quiet hum of banking systems, billions moved not chaotically but with purpose. Each note played in precision, each movement designed, and the symphony of influence unfolded unseen. Semion Mogilevich had transformed money into poetry, and in that poetry, his empire danced. Some things are meant to be hidden. Some truths are never spoken aloud. Semion Mogilevich understood that the greatest power often resides not in what is seen, but in what remains unseen, unspoken, and unknowable. By the turn of the millennium, Mogilevich's empire was vast, intricate, and almost entirely invisible. To outsiders, his influence was inferred rather than observed. Deals moved quietly, decisions shifted subtly, and yet, for those who looked closely, patterns began to emerge. But for most, the vast machinery of his network appeared as a series of coincidental events, mundane operations, and independent decisions, all perfectly orchestrated, all hiding the invisible architect at its center. One of the greatest secrets was the scope of his connections. Governments, corporations, banks, and private investors were all nodes in a network few could map. Each connection was deliberate. Some provided information, others facilitated transactions, while still others reinforced loyalty and trust within the system. And yet, no one person held complete knowledge. Compartmentalization ensured that even close associates could only see fragments of the operation, preserving the integrity of the empire. Mogilevich's methods relied heavily on the art of controlled ambiguity. A bank in Zurich might process a transfer believing it to be routine. A corporate board in Vienna might execute decisions unaware that their actions reinforced an unseen strategy. Intermediaries, while competent, were guided subtly, often by instructions that were concise, yet layered with meaning. It was a system of invisible guidance, where the real narrative existed only in Semion's mind. Some of the most critical aspects of the empire were never documented. Certain contracts, transactions, or alliances were structured informally, based on trust and shared understanding rather than written legalities. These unrecorded arrangements allowed flexibility, deniability, and a speed of operation unmatched by conventional structures. Outsiders would never know of these agreements. Even participants might forget the full details, leaving Semion as the sole custodian of institutional memory. Within this framework, Mogilevich also implemented strategic redundancies. Should a bank question a transaction or a partner falter in execution, alternative pathways were ready. Multiple layers of contingency ensured that operations could continue without interruption, maintaining the illusion of independence while safeguarding the underlying strategy. This careful layering rendered the network resilient against unforeseen disruptions, yet completely opaque to outsiders. Mogilevich's discretion extended to his own movements and communications. He traveled lightly, often alone or with a single trusted intermediary. Meetings were brief, held in unremarkable offices or quiet cafes. Messages were encoded in subtle language, often delivered indirectly. By limiting visibility, he minimized risk and maximized control. Even those closest to him rarely saw the full picture. The more others believed they were autonomous, the more effective his influence became. One illustrative example involved a series of energy contracts across multiple countries. Public records showed legitimate transactions, each compliant with local law. Yet behind the scenes, the contracts were interconnected, creating leverage and influence invisible to regulators, competitors, and partners alike. Semion had anticipated contingencies, layered pathways, and the potential for human error. The outcome, when realized, appeared organic, but it was entirely by design. Mogilevich also maintained a careful balance of secrecy and trust. He understood that absolute secrecy without reliability could fracture networks. Conversely, oversharing could expose vulnerabilities. By providing only necessary information, coupled with clear incentives and oversight, he ensured operational efficiency while preserving security. Associates acted decisively, guided by understanding and alignment rather than fear. The empire's most remarkable secret was perhaps its total invisibility. No headquarters displayed the extent of its reach, no public announcement declared its acquisitions, no report detailed the full web of connections. Even law enforcement and regulators, while aware of some components, could not assemble the entirety of operations. The world perceived fragmented, independent actors. In reality, all paths led to a single mind orchestrating the whole. Mogilevich often reflected on the power of the unseen. Whereas violence, wealth, or notoriety might command attention, invisibility allowed longevity, adaptability, and ultimate control. By remaining in the shadows, he could influence, correct, and expand operations without interference. This silent mastery became the defining characteristic of his empire, a vast, dynamic, and unseen force shaping the world quietly yet decisively. Even small errors or anomalies were absorbed by the network. Transactions delayed, intermediaries faltering, or minor legal inquiries were anticipated, mitigated, and corrected before they could escalate. Each event was logged, analyzed, and incorporated into the operational model. Mistakes became lessons. Lessons reinforced control. Control sustained secrecy. Over time, the system became self-correcting, resilient, and elegantly concealed. By nightfall, as city lights glimmered across Moscow and Vienna, Semion Mogilevich remained at his desk. Reports scrolled before him, intermediaries executed instructions, and transactions flowed across continents. The empire pulsed silently, a living organism guided by a single intellect. Outsiders saw chaos, insiders saw opportunity, and only Semion saw the full orchestration, the intricate lattice of influence, loyalty, and calculation that defined his empire. In the world outside, life moved with apparent randomness. In the quiet corridors of unseen power, every ripple, every movement, every decision was anticipated, directed, and refined. And at the center of it all, Semion Mogilevich watched, the architect of secrets no one could ever fully know. True power leaves no footprints, yet shapes the path of the world. Semion Mogilevich understood that the greatest influence is silent, patient, and unseen. The empire he had built was more than wealth or transactions. It was a network of minds, a lattice of influence, and a legacy of quiet mastery. By the dawn of the 21st century, Semion Mogilevich's operations spanned continents, industries, and governments. What outsiders saw as independent events, market shifts, corporate decisions, policy adjustments, were threads woven into a pattern only he could perceive. His influence was omnipresent yet invisible, subtle yet decisive. Across the web of banks, corporations, and intermediaries, his touch was silent, like a conductor guiding an orchestra of billions, unseen by the audience but felt in every note. Mogilevich's philosophy of silent control had evolved over decades. Each chapter of his life, observing, analyzing, learning from failure, expanding networks, and refining strategies, culminated in an empire resilient beyond expectation. Unlike conventional notions of organized crime, where power is enforced through violence or notoriety, his was power exercised through intellect, foresight, and system design. It was durable, adaptive, and unassailable by spectacle alone. At the heart of this system was a deep understanding of human behavior. Associates, intermediaries, and partners acted autonomously, yet their actions harmonized with the larger design. Loyalty was cultivated through alignment of interests, discipline, and subtle guidance rather than fear. Mistakes became data for optimization. Success reinforced trust. Each node of the network reinforced another, creating a self-sustaining lattice that functioned independently yet remained guided by his mind. Financial mastery remained central to his influence. Transfers, investments, and corporate maneuvers were choreographed with precision, creating effects that were perceptible only in hindsight. Regulators observed compliance, markets adjusted to patterns, and competitors acted unaware of the subtle forces shaping outcomes. Money, once a tool of exchange, had become a medium of influence, a language that orchestrated markets, policies, and human behavior. It was, in Semion's own terms, poetic. Even the most complex crises were absorbed by the network. Shifts in regulation, unexpected political changes, or deviations by associates were anticipated, mitigated and incorporated. Contingency plans, layered structures, and adaptive pathways ensured continuity. The empire did not falter, it evolved. In this way, Mogilevich had built a living system, capable of absorbing shocks and turning them into opportunities. He also understood perception. By remaining unseen, Mogilevich amplified his influence. Attention invites scrutiny, visibility exposes vulnerability. The quieter the power, the more enduring it becomes. His decisions, executed subtly, created outcomes that seemed natural, inevitable, or coincidental to those affected. It was a mastery of invisible guidance, where influence operated without recognition or resistance. As he reviewed reports spanning Europe, North America, and emerging markets, the depth of his empire became apparent even to himself. Each transaction, every contract, and all interactions were aligned in a complex yet coherent network. Decisions at distant banks, boardrooms, and government offices flowed seamlessly with his strategy. What appeared as independent outcomes was, in truth, an interconnected system shaped by foresight and intellect. The legacy of Mogilevich's empire was not merely wealth or connections, it was the architecture of silent power. Future observers, historians, or investigators might trace fragments of influence, speculate on patterns, or guess at causal links, but the entirety of his design would remain known only to him. He had created a system where control and autonomy coexisted, where each action reinforced the network while preserving secrecy, and where his mind remained the central axis around which everything turned. Even in solitude, Mogilevich reflected on the elegance of his accomplishments. Power had been exercised not through confrontation, spectacle, or fear, but through strategy, anticipation, and the orchestration of human and financial systems. Every challenge, failure, and minor disruption had been integrated, refined, and used to strengthen the lattice. In this quiet mastery, he recognized the ultimate truth: the most enduring influence is invisible, subtle, and patient. As night descended over the city spanning his empire, lights flickered in distant offices, boardrooms, and banks. Systems hummed, decisions unfolded, and markets shifted, all guided by patterns too complex for any observer to fully discern. And in the center of it all, Semion Mogilevich remained at his desk, calm and deliberate, hands steepled, observing the living network he had designed. The empire was not loud, it was not violent, it was not flashy, but it was absolute. In a world of chaos, spectacle, and fleeting authority, he had mastered the art of invisible control. And in the quiet rhythm of the systems he orchestrated, Semion Mogilevich left a legacy that would endure long after the lights of his office dimmed. The proof that true power is exercised not through force, but through intellect, subtlety, and patience. And so, the empire of Semion Mogilevich continued to thrive, silent and unseen, an enduring testament to the power of the mind over the world. The ripples of his influence, imperceptible yet undeniable, would echo across continents, industries, and generations, a legacy of quiet mastery few would ever fully comprehend.